Welcome to the RSIS Distinguished Book Launch of Singapore is Still Not an Island, More Views on Singapore Foreign Policy, a collection of essays and speeches by Bilahari Kausikan. When this event was open to the public, it was very quickly oversubscribed. So a very warm welcome also to all those who are viewing this event live stream online. Ambassador Ong Keng Yong is the Executive Deputy Chairman of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Director of the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, and Head of the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at RSIS. He's also Singapore's non-resident High Commissioner to Pakistan and non-resident Ambassador to Iran. And he also serves as Chairman of the Singapore International Foundation. There are more details on the program for those of you who are interested, but in the interest of time, I would like to be able to extend an invitation on behalf of Ambassador Ong to all of you here to enjoy the proceedings today. And now he will come up to make his welcome remarks.
Thank you, Lian Chu, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. A particular warm welcome to Mr. Wong Kan Seng, who is our guest of honor for this event. As Lian Chu said, the response is tremendous, but I offered a few prayers last night, so it rained. Therefore, the response is now, or the attendance is now manageable. Yeah. Together with us, there are many other colleagues from all my previous full-time employment, and now I have all my RSIS colleagues here. But my job is just to basically formally welcome all of you, and maybe just add a few sentences about Bilahari's latest adventure. Yeah, we were all very happy that he retired, and we thought we could have a bit of reprieve from him. But he ended up writing books and more books, and he insisted that they must be launched properly. So here we are. I think the first one was a yellow color book called Singapore is Not an Island. Yeah, yellow color book. Today this one I think is a pink color one. But I must tell you, when I encountered the first book at the bookshop, I wasn't surprised. But when I went to the National Museum in Singapore, right in the middle of the room, there was this bookcase displaying his first book, the yellow color book. And my wife said, wow, so fast the museum accepted this as a historical relic. But I said, no, they're selling it. And then she's puzzled. This museum should be selling historical documents and all that. You mean this book is already a historical document? I say, maybe Bilahari's name is a attraction. So at least the museum gift shop will not be so quiet, you see. Yeah, but anyway, it was by the time I went around looking at the other things in the in the gift shop of the museum and came back, the copy that I wanted to pick up was already gone, because that morning 3 copies left on the bookshelf were all snapped up by whoever. They think that it was a tourist brochure because of the nice picture you have outside. So I didn't manage to buy any book, but luckily my first encounter with the book on the bookshelf, I took a picture, so I sent to him, and it's a testimony of I'm not pulling his leg. So now I don't know what to do with this pink copy. Hopefully the museum will stock up more copies. Straits Times Press, where are you? Better go and make sure that they have boxes of it. But substantively, it is a very good read. I went through it. Some of the speeches I heard Bilahari said have now been transformed into good chapters of the book. So I hope you will enjoy this publication. But I want to formally thank Mr. Wong Kang Seng for honoring us today, honoring Bilahari, and the rest of our guests and participants here today. I haven't seen Peter Chan for years. Yeah, I'm glad that he is here. He used to be one of my bosses at the Foreign Ministry. Tan Chin Tiong, yeah, another of my bosses. So, Bilahari, not bad. You at least helped to glamorize this NTU alumni club. Yeah. This used to be a very good place for alumni of the NTU to hang around, but when they started to take action against the liquid bar, things go haywire and downhill. So hopefully tonight we will see a resurrection of some of the old jolly time that we have here in this place. The book has many chapters. As I said, I went through it, but I think all of you should look at it yourself. What is more important is that today we have Chang Heng Chi, Peter Ho, yeah, and a few other important thinkers of Singapore foreign policy and diplomacy here. So they are here to also talk about what Bilahari has produced in his book. And I think we look forward to hearing their comments, and hopefully we will be a bit more wiser. And the good thing about this book, Bilahari, is that now at least we have other things to look at on our social media. Yeah, yeah. So my wife is getting ready because I told her that it might be online today, and she said, okay, then something different from the last few weeks. Yeah. Hopefully we get more wisdom from this set of postings on the media. But I should stop here. But once again, let me warmly welcome all of you, especially Mr. Wong. Mr. Wong Kang Seng was our boss for several years in MFA. And thank you, Bilahari, for allowing us in RSIS to help you launch this book. Yeah. I think we should let the rest of us here and those of you online to listen to Bilahari and the rest of the invited speakers. So thank you, and hopefully all of you will enjoy this book launch and your interaction with all the VIPs and writers of future books here. Thank you very much.
It is my honor now to introduce our guest of honor, Mr. Wong Kang Seng. Mr. Wong was the Deputy Prime Minister from 2005 to 2011, Minister for Home Affairs from 1994 to 2010, and Minister for Foreign Affairs from 1988 to 1994. He retired after serving 26 years in the Singapore government. His last appointment was as the Coordinating Minister for National Security and Minister in charge of the Population and Talent Division in the Prime Minister's office. During his time as Government Minister, he chaired several ministerial-level committees that coordinated work across several ministries, such as on national security and crisis management. Please join me in inviting our guest of honor, Mr. Wong Kang Seng, to make his address.
Well, thank you, Lian Chu, for the introduction. And I must say that I'm very happy to see so many of my, I won't use the word old, but former colleagues here in this room. With Chin Tiong, Peter, who else I miss here? Also two Peters here, by the way, and Keng Yong and many others. And some of you I can't see that well, so pardon me if I don't name you. I am not as humorous as Keng Yong. But I must say that I'm very honored to be invited to this book launch by Bilahari. And also, of course, I'm thankful to RSIS for considering me to perform this task. And indeed, it's been some years since I see some of you. And I also want to congratulate Lian Chu for her hard work in bringing about this successful publication. It is the second volume of personal essays and speeches by Bilahari. I read him from time to time as it is published in the Straits Times and other papers. After he retired from the Foreign Service, he seems to have written many articles of interest to people. And the title of Mr. Bilahari's two books, Singapore is not an island and Singapore is still not an island, convey the idea that we in Singapore, a small city-state, cannot insulate ourselves from the regional or international developments. In fact, in this sense, Singapore will never be an island. We are so dependent on the world for a living that we must remain relevant to those who find us useful, and yet we must have the independence of mind and action to protect our national interests. The United States and China are entering into a period of great geopolitical contest for leadership to reshape the world international order. The coming decades will be very uncertain and difficult. For older folks like me, indeed, I can consider myself in that class, the Cold War years of rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union seem simpler and more clear-cut. There were just two blocs, the communists and the developed democracies, and the rest of us were not aligned. But at the time, the world was less well off. At the risk of oversimplifying my analysis in the next few minutes, I'm going to say the following: that following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the political systems in some countries underwent changes. There was also a rise of capitalism. China was also opening up and reforming its economy. It did relatively well and joined WTO in 2001. It did even better economically after that. Hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens were lifted out of poverty. There is a rising middle class, and China grew in influence and reach, and to some, it overreached. The United States has begun to view China's rise as a strategic challenge to its position as the world's #1 superpower. When China was poor, it was not a threat. But over the years, China's economy grew to become the world's second largest economy, about 2/3 the size of the United States. It was also modernizing its armed forces. Hence, the powers in the United States decided that something must be done to slow China's rise. The leaders believed that China was not going to be like them. They decided to impose tariffs and other restrictive measures on China. The strategic rivalry between the US and its allies and China will now define how the world will look like in the decades to come. Our region is now the epicenter of this rivalry between them. The contest has many dimensions: geopolitical, economic, technological, and security. Until recently, words like bifurcation, decoupling were used whenever one talks about the US and China contest. Then decoupling was soft-pedaled to be called de-risking. It is understandable that one has to be careful to avoid excessive dependencies, but not to cut off economic links. It is understandable too to plan for backups and build for resilience, as the Americans themselves and their allies are doing. It is also understandable that China is responding by trying to become more self-reliant, but both sides must be mindful that their actions should not undermine the foundations of the prosperity upon which all of us, the US and China included, depended on and have built. Unlike the former Soviet Union or contemporary Russia, China, like the US, is now a major economic player, global economic player. Last year, in 2022, together with the US and China, the US and China accounted for 43% of the global GDP. Whatever their concerns about each other, decoupling or de-risking or trying to become more self-reliant, if taken too far, could be disastrous for both of them and all the rest of us. Fortunately, there are signs that both countries are beginning to understand this reality, and the world is large enough for all powers to collaborate and thrive. U.S. Secretary Janet Yellen said as much recently during her trip to China. The fact that before her visit, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met Wang Yi in Vienna, and the Chinese received Secretary of State Tony Blinken, the CIA Chief William Burns, and the Climate Special Envoy John Kerry in Beijing, while Commerce Minister Wang Wentao visited Washington for talks with his counterpart. All that show that both sides are trying to set limits to the competition and not let it get out of hand. Last year, President Joe Biden met President Xi Jinping in Bali. Hopefully, they will meet this year at the G20 and the APEC meetings. But the relationship is still fragile, and we should carefully watch what they do. Responsible leadership is needed to provide a stable environment for ordinary people in all countries to make a decent living. All governments aspire to bring a better life for their citizens. I hope the United States and China will manage the differences rationally and find a modus vivendi to work together for the common good of all countries. There are no winners in confrontation and conflicts. There are broader and equally critical issues that require the cooperation of all major powers to play their responsible part, be they on climate change, pandemic preparation, anti-narcotics trafficking, ethical use of AI or ChatGPT, anti-terrorism, and so on. For Singapore to navigate the complexities of great power competition requires a national effort. It is not just a matter for the MFA or even the government as a whole. Singapore became independent when the US-Soviet Cold War competition was hot in Southeast Asia, and only 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis that brought the world to the brink of a nuclear war. At that time, we had much less economic, diplomatic, and military capabilities of our own at our disposal. Today, Singapore is better resourced, or has better resources, with a skilled workforce, which are the people who place their trust in the leaders to plan their future. The trust built up over the decades between the people and the government must be sustained to help Singapore navigate a more treacherous world. We survived and prospered under the most adverse conditions in our early years. There is no reason why we cannot do so again, provided we maintain a clear sense of our national interests and hold together as a nation. The historical perspective in many of the essays in Bilahari's new book will be a valuable lesson to many young Singaporeans who have no personal memory of the events we have experienced. They cover a wide range of issues and deal with Singapore's core interests. Foreign policy must be based on a strong domestic consensus. Bilahari points out that the public and policy makers often pay more attention to events and not enough attention to the processes in which events are embedded. By putting them in proper perspective, we can appreciate the complexities of events and can maintain what he described as, quote, the psychological poise, unquote, that comes with such a perspective. I've known and worked with Bilahari during the time I served in government. I still have quite vivid memories of our time together. Our discussions were always guided by our collective sense of what was best for Singapore's national interests, and the policies that were established thereafter certainly stood the test of time. It is for this reason that I'm pleased to be here to launch his second book of essays, Singapore is Still Not an Island. I look forward to hearing more of Bilahari's views here today and to the discussion with the book's commentators, Professor Chan Heng Chee, our former ambassador to the US, and Mr. Peter Ho, formerly President, Permanent Secretary of MFA and head of our civil service, both of whom have also distinguished themselves in their contributions to Singapore's foreign policy achievements. You know, I hardly speak publicly after I stepped down from cabinet. Here today, I'm speaking to you on my own, in my own capacity. Thank you very much for your patience and listening to it. Thank you.
Now, many of you already know Bilahari and followed his published commentaries and perspectives on regional and global developments, so he needs very little introduction here today. He's currently chairman of the Middle East Institute, an autonomous institute of the National University of Singapore. He has spent his entire career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, serving in a variety of appointments at home and abroad, including as ambassador to the Russian Federation and permanent representative to the UN in New York, and of course, as permanent secretary of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. May I invite Mr. Bilahari Kausikan.
I want to thank all of you who are here, whether in person or online, for attending this book launch. I'm grateful you have taken the trouble to be here this afternoon, this rainy afternoon. I'm sure there were much better ways of spending your time. A very special thanks to my old boss, Mr. Wong Kan Seng, for agreeing to be guest of honor. To my old comrade, Ong Keng Yong, for getting RSIS to organize the event, and to my old friends Peter Ho and Chan Heng Chi for not resisting being dragooned into appearing on the panel. Heng Chi was also my teacher at the then University of Singapore. So I must emphasize, most strongly emphasize, that if anyone takes umbrage at anything in this or my previous book, it is not in any way her fault. She is not to blame. I wasn't a very obedient student. When my friend Tan Nen Chu first suggested collecting my ramblings 8 years ago, I'm talking about the Yellow Book, I was reluctant. I allowed myself to be persuaded only after she agreed to do all the hard work, as she has done again for this second collection. So an extra special thanks to you, Len Chu. But when Len Chu suggested the second collection, I was a little less reluctant, because everything that happened in the intervening years had convinced me that Singaporeans need to be more exposed to the complexity of international relations. There was a growing awareness that the world around us could not be ignored, and consequently there was a greater interest in international developments, at least among a certain section of Singaporeans. But this increasing interest did not necessarily result in better understanding. Indeed, it seemed to me that too often, the greater the interest, the more simplistic the view. Among those that considered themselves sophisticated observers of international developments, the intellectual fad of the moment too often passed for analysis. And far too many in the majority who have, understandably, only an occasional interest in international affairs, turn to social media to tell them what to think. And the wildest theories are too often passed on uncritically as the received truth. Consequently, there is even sometimes confusion over the very idea of the national interest. Now, let me be clear. I do not think my views are definitive views. Let me be absolutely clear about this. Mine is a view, but I do not claim that it is the view. In fact, there is no such thing as a definitive view, because assessments of international developments are always contingent and subject to revision. International relations are not physics, and diplomacy is not engineering that must always conform to the laws of physics. There is always room for debate. But it seems to me that many discussions on international issues, even among the informed, was drifting away from fundamentals. Fundamentals about Singapore, and fundamentals about the very nature of international relations. And this is dangerous. Assessments are always contingent and subject to continual revision. By any point of time, the authoritative statement of our position on any particular international issue must come from the government. That is, after all, one of the functions of government, to form a view on foreign policy issues and keep revising those views as circumstances evolve, of course, always in the light of our national interests. An authoritative view should not be the same thing as a static view. But as I have a certain practical experience of foreign policy and diplomacy, my views, while only those of a pensioner, may nevertheless have a certain utility regardless of whether the reader agrees or disagrees with me. And as a pensioner, I now have the ability to speak clearly in public. This is a luxury that governments cannot always indulge in, and which too many academics avoid because they get no professional credit for doing so. As for our newspapers and TV, the mainstream media, this term has somehow acquired a faint whiff of the disreputable. Let me say that while I am sure they try their best, they have their own limitations and constraints. He did not ask me to say what I'm about to say. The new editor of the Straits Times was an experienced Foreign Service officer before he went to journalism, and I am sure if he's allowed the leeway to use his experience, the quality of his international coverage should improve. But that's a digression, and he didn't pay me to say that. It has become axiomatic that the world has become more complex and uncertain. In no small part because, as Mr. Wong has pointed out, US-China strategic competition is now clearly a structural condition of 21st century international relations. And all that has happened in the last 8 years since the first book came out has increasingly convinced me, that the key to successfully managing the increasingly complex international environment, particularly our relationships with the US and China, lies in our domestic politics. I don't mean just the domestic politics of foreign policy, that's of course important, but domestic politics more broadly understood. Our relationships with the US and China intersect with and confronts us with a crucial, indeed existential question, encompassing every aspect of policy. And that question is how to preserve the essential values on which independent Singapore was established amid the often contradictory imperatives of day-to-day policy making and politics. And that essential value is, of course, multiracialism. If we can maintain this core value, we can manage the external complexities. I have no doubt about that. But unfortunately, the converse is also true. The essential political task is to maintain the psychological poise of Singaporeans amidst the complexity and uncertainty. And psychological poise comprises, first of all and most crucially, belief in our own agency. Belief that our interests are ours to define and our destiny is in our own hands. There is always something that even the smallest country in the most dire of circumstances can do. If this was not so, Singapore as we know it today would not exist. Psychological poise also requires us to take a balanced view of US-China relations, seeing them in proper perspective, neither exaggerating the complexities nor underplaying them, and of course maintaining situational awareness of where our national interest lies in the sometimes disorienting swirl of events. This seems obvious, but Singapore's unique status as the only sovereign state outside Greater China with an ethnic Chinese majority but largely English-educated population sometimes makes the obvious easier said than done. About 35 years ago, Mr. Wong might remember this, I was a young note-taker when the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, then Prime Minister, told the American ambassador in Singapore that the Singapore ground was not naturally pro-Western. We were then in a quarrel with the Reagan administration over the attempt of a group of its diplomats to interfere in our domestic politics. We expelled an American diplomat and the squabble was soon smoothed over as we had other more important interests in common. But what Mr. Lee said about the Singapore ground has been indelibly etched in my mind ever since. Not being naturally pro-Western doesn't mean our ground is naturally anti-Western either. Those are different attitudes. But the ethnic sentimentality of some Singaporeans, coupled with not being naturally pro-Western, can lead to muddled thinking over what are our national interests in the current external environment. Most Singaporeans don't understand either China or America as well as they may think they understand. When it is explained to them, I think most Singaporeans generally will support the government's position on the specifics of US-China relations, such as the South China Sea or Taiwan. But there is nevertheless a certain segment of the public, not the majority, certainly not the majority, but I think not an inconsequential number either, to whom it almost seems as if China can do no wrong and America can do no right. This segment, some of whom are highly educated, operate on stereotypes derived from the media, and not just the media or the People's Republic of China either. And strangely, it has been my experience, if you point out China's mistakes or weaknesses to those to whom China can do no wrong, more often than not, their response is not to rebut what you say about China, but to point out America's weaknesses and mistakes. There is no great harm if all they mean is that every country has its own strengths and weaknesses. That's obvious to me. But the peculiarity of this mode of thought is that in their minds, America's weaknesses and mistakes somehow erases or excuses China's mistakes and weaknesses. And often, while they correctly point out the Western and specifically the American media's biases about China, and therefore reject the American media's analysis of China, they are quite happy to accept the American media's biases about the US. To be hypercritical is part of American media culture and applies as much or even more to the US as to foreign countries. And these are all symptoms of muddled thinking, and as a sound foreign policy must rest on a sound domestic consensus, potentially dangerous. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've spoken for too long, so let me wrap up with a final point. Seeing US-China relations in their proper perspectives entails understanding that the conditions that brought them together in 1972, their common enemy, the Soviet Union, no longer exists and cannot be recreated. Nostalgia is the most futile of emotions in international relations. From 1972 to about 2010 or thereabouts, there were periods of tension in US-China relations and differences over issues such as Taiwan and human rights. But their common enemy ensured differences did not escalate too much and kept them focused on engagement. Now the emphasis has been reversed. Engagement will certainly not cease, and as Mr. Wong has pointed out, there were a number of recent high-level discussions between the US and China. However, the overall emphasis is now on competition, and this makes engagement brittle. Although I think nuclear deterrence will keep the peace between the US and China, as it kept the peace between the US and the former Soviet Union. The risk is not war by design, but an accident getting out of hand. Some degree of competition is inherent in any system of sovereign states, and competition sometimes turns to conflict, whether by design or by accident. The 20th century was one of the bloodiest in world history. For a short and historically exceptional period of maybe about 20 years, from 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, this harsh reality of the inevitability of competition was masked by the overwhelming dominance of American power. And even during this exceptional period, there were genocidal wars in the Balkans and Africa, and the US invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. We have now returned to a more historically normal period of world history. In 1965, when Singapore had independence thrust upon us, as Mr. Wong has pointed out, the US-Soviet Cold War was hot in Southeast Asia. We had far less capabilities at our disposal than we do today to deal with a more immediately dangerous environment. Yet we not only survived and prospered as an independent and sovereign country pursuing our own national interests. And there is no a priori reason why we should not do so again in this latest iteration of the historical cycles of great power competition, provided we keep our composure, provided we remain focused on our core interests, and provided we get our domestic politics right. On that note of qualified hopefulness, I shall end. Thank you for listening to me so patiently.
We come to the section on the remarks by commentators now. Thank you, Bilahari, for that. I shall introduce very briefly Professor Chan Eng-Chee and Mr. Peter Ho, and afterwards invite them on stage. Professor Chan Eng-Chee, formerly Singapore's ambassador to the United States and also Singapore's permanent representative to the UN, is now ambassador at large at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She is professor at the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, chair of the RSIS Yusof Ishak Institute, a member of the Board of Trustees of the National University of Singapore, as well as at several other prominent academic institutions. Internationally, Ambassador Chan serves as Global Co-Chair of Asia Society, a member of the Board of Trustees of Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and of the Council of Urban Initiatives. And in Singapore, she also serves as a member of the Presidential Council for Minority Rights. Mr. Peter Ho is a Senior Advisor to the Centre for Strategic Futures and a Senior Fellow in the Civil Service College. He is also Chairman of the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Singapore, URA, Chairman of the Social Science Research Council, Chairman of the Campus for Research Excellence and Technological Enterprise Governing Council, Chairman of the Office for Space Technology and Industry Board, Chairman of the National Gallery of Singapore. He is a member of the board of the National Research Foundation and also of the Board of Governors of RSIS and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He retired from Singapore Administrative Service in 2010 after a 34-year career in the public service. He was head of the civil service, concurrently with his other appointments of Permanent Secretary in Foreign Affairs, National Security and Intelligence Coordination, and special duties in the Prime Minister's office. And before that, he was Permanent Secretary of Defence, and he was also the inaugural chairman of the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore. So if you can put your hands together, I would like to invite Bilahari, Professor Chan Ying-chi, and Peter Ho on stage.
Good afternoon, Ong Keng Yong, Mr. Wong Kan Sing. I'm not going to do a review of Bilahari's book. I don't want to get into a debate or quarrel. But Bilahari is a super realist, a hyper realist, an extreme realist. His book of essays are lessons in realism in foreign policy, or if you want, hard truths of foreign policy. But it is a very important perspective. And apart from the perspective, you also get very good analysis of particular situations on the speeches he writes. And I would say I agree generally with most of the readings and trends that he predicts. I nuance things a little. Now, I would like to make a few points on what makes a good or successful foreign policy. Not to refute the realism needed, but to add on other dimensions. This applies to Singapore, but could apply elsewhere. I want to highlight 3 points. 1, leaders matter. 2, narrative matters. 3, retail foreign policy matters. Now, I want to share with you what I've learned about foreign policy after all these years that the university did not teach me. Individuals matter. Leaders matter in foreign policy. But leaders will work with the fundamentals of foreign policy, and in our case, Singapore fundamentals. And fundamentals are based on basic facts about Singapore that you cannot ignore. From these basic facts of Singapore, we work out the interest of Singapore, the self-interest, national interest that Bilahari emphasized. That is why people, leaders, are important. If we had a dim leader, or not so bright leaders, they may not have diagnosed the inescapable realities of Singapore in the same way and found solutions to deal with the situation, or come up with original, authentic thinking. That has been the hallmark of our foreign policy and Singapore's success in foreign policies. Our leaders worked as a team. Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam. Lee Kuan Yew said after his trip to the United States in 1967, when he met Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, Dean Rusk, and Robert McNamara, young Singapore, just independent Singapore, small country, little red dot, going to the United States and meeting the President of the United States and the team. Senator Mike Mansfield and others. And he spoke to Asia Society, Council on Foreign Relations. He went to Chicago, Los Angeles, and media generally. He said when he returned, and I quote him, "Kingsley and Raja were disturbed that I sounded too pro-American, defending Johnson's intervention in Vietnam. This might alienate our grassroots leader, our base. They advised me to move back to a more neutral position. So Lee Kuan Yew changed his language to a more critical stance of the US in the Vietnam War, but he gave clear support to the US presence in Vietnam. I think the message here is you have to be aware of your base. We are always looking for balance, and at that time, we were also keen that Singapore, in its early independence, should burnish our non-aligned credentials. Now, the early leadership of Mr. Lee and his team did many things. They laid out the realities of the Singapore situation and principles for our foreign policy, the way the city should be governed. Many foreign policy and defense ideas were initiated then. Non-alignment, importance of multilateralism, that Singapore must be extraordinary to survive, the poison shrimp theory of defense strategy, the global city, that came from Rajaratnam, and FTAs, that came from Lee Kuan Yew, to extend Singapore's economic space. Now, Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong, too, worked with his team, and Mr. Goh Chok Tong developed the FTA idea further and fully for Singapore, and most of the FTAs were done during his tenure as Prime Minister. He also developed an opening up of Singapore to India, the second wing to India, because Lee Kuan Yew opened to China. But Goh Chok Tong also developed the multilateral ties of Singapore. During his time, we pushed for ASEM, FILAC, Latin America. The ARF had many fathers. I think we also claim to be one of them, but I think it was Japan flew the idea first, then the Australians, etc. He tried the Sijori concept, Singapore, Johor, and Indonesia, but I think, it didn't sort of work as well. But all the time, Singapore was reaching out, building networks. Political scientists today write of networks as a new phenomenon in international relations, and Anne-Marie Slaughter writes of networks as the way which the global economy can be governed. Now, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, Prime Minister. When he became Prime Minister, much of the ground and framework were built. With his team, Lee Hsien Loong built on the FTAs and the internationalizing of Singapore, TPP, CPTPP, RCEP, etc. But during his term, some of the movements that were occurring today, seen as tectonic shifts, were emerging. Globalization was showing its dark side, and deglobalization had begun. The Tea Party in the US Congress was just formed, and that led to Trump's America First. The America we knew was changing. A global financial crisis saw the US down and losing confidence, and China growing in confidence. I think Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong's job was to keep arguing for keeping the trading system open and fighting protectionism, and also pushing for competition. He was also dealing with China's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea, and also wondering what US disengagement could mean for Singapore or the region. And so he spoke quite a great deal on this. He strengthened our bilateral regional ties by working out with Prime Minister Najib Razak the terms of points of agreement, which was a document which was started in the 1990 between Singapore and Malaysia over the future of the railway land owned by the Malaysian government through the Malaysian Railway. It was signed first by Lee Kuan Yew and Finance Minister Tun Daim Zainuddin of Malaysia. The implementation was deadlocked for many years over disputes of interpretation, and it was Lee Hsien Loong and Najib Razak that broke the deadlock, which had lasted 20 years at their retreat in May 2010. Then this year, in January 2023, Prime Minister Lee came to an agreement with President Jokowi on 3 long-standing and challenging bilateral issues between Indonesia and Singapore, and airspace management, defense cooperation, and extradition. PM said they were durable agreements for the long haul and would create a solid foundation to move relations forward. So, leaders matter, point 1. Point 2, narrative matters. Not only must leaders make wise choices in foreign policy, creating a narrative around the policy is important too. How to tell the story to persuade the population it is the right choice and the right policy. There is a clear difference between making and doing foreign policy today from that of the past. As Bilahari has said, foreign policy is today not just the interests of the political elite and bureaucracy. You know, it involves a whole lot of people, and people have become far more interested in foreign policy. They think they know, but they may not know as much as they think they know. People are very much interested now, and it is a result of the educated population and social media and technology. So it's so easy to Google up, to read up things. Everyone is a Google doctor. So we have Google foreign policy experts, and all have strong views. So putting out clear and good narratives are needed. One must not just see Chinese narratives or US narratives or Russian narratives or European narratives. We all have to control our narratives based on our own interests. Singapore should have its own narrative out, loud and clear, to explain our policies. You know, during the Ukraine war, we've seen the battle of narratives. It is between Russia and Ukraine, Russia against NATO and Ukraine. It is said the Chinese were helping to spread the Russian narrative. Singaporeans did not understand, many Singaporeans, why the Singapore government decided on sanctions against Russia. When we explained about the breach of the UN Charter and about big state invading a small state, I think the point was better hoisted in. So the narrative matters. I come to the third point. Retail foreign policy matters. Retail foreign policy as in retail politics. This point is related to the narratives. We have reached the moment of the democratization of foreign policy. That is, interest in foreign policy is widespread. It's just not just a small circle of foreign policy people, journalists, and top business people. The population is interested. And the interest can be quite intense. When global issues were about Afghanistan or the Iraq War, the interests were less. Or even when we had the Cambodian issue in Southeast Asia, I don't think the interest at that time was as much at the grassroots level. Today, some issues register high, very high. The US-China rivalry, for one, is followed with avid interest and strong views. I think Palestine too, 9/11, not so hard to explain. It wasn't so hard to explain because we found terrorists amongst our midst, and it was easy to explain why we supported the United States so strongly, why we were supporting Afghanistan and then Iraq. But the issue of choice of being on the side of the US or China will not come uncontested. Singaporeans have different views and will express them. And it's not just the Chinese population of Singapore, the Indians and the Malays, the other minorities have a position too. So how do you persuade the population that whatever policy we adopt at the time is the best possible policy for our self-interest? I think our politicians have to pay attention to that. And retail foreign policy, speaking to key groups, is extremely important. We speak to groups when it's business, when we have economic issues, but foreign policy, I think that has to gain attention now. Thank you. This outreach.
Mr. Wong Kan Sing, guest of honor, Ong Keng Yong, Executive Deputy Chairman, RSIS. Despite Bilahari's warning about the risks of indulging in nostalgia in foreign policy, I'm going to do exactly that and indulge in a bit of nostalgia by telling a story, a narrative, if you will. I was parachuted twice into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, rank amateur in the first instance, and then 6 years later as a somewhat more seasoned amateur, but still an amateur. And in both instances, it was like being dropped into a war zone. And the metaphor is quite apt. Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian general and military thinker, very famous if you do bother to study military history and military strategy. He famously wrote that war is an extension of diplomacy by other means. And arguably, the converse also is true, that diplomacy is an extension of war by other means. Diplomacy is not a two-dimensional game like chess. It's infinitely more complex, with many degrees of freedom, more like a three-dimensional game of chess, if we can imagine such a game, and probably much worse. There are many factors at play, many of them hidden from view. There are strategic and economic issues and other national interests. There are political and personal calculations which we can only guess at, and there are egos to contend with. There are historical factors and cultural factors to consider. It is an extremely complex arena bordering on the chaotic. Chaos, of course, is the province of war. For an amateur confronted with these enormous complexities, the feeling of helplessness is almost inevitable, especially in the beginning. And this is where my account leads to Bilahari. He was my colleague in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during both my stints. If I was the amateur, he was the professional, and I soon discovered a gifted professional at that. Where I could only see complexity and chaos, he could see the path forward through the smoke and haze. He could see the way ahead. It is that uncanny ability to see things which others can only dimly perceive, and then to analyze and act to reduce the complexity and chaos that mark out a good diplomat. It is an ability not just to look at the components of the problem, but also to look at the problem in a holistic way. In my experience, it is one of the most salient qualities of an effective diplomat, because the operating environment that the diplomat operates in is VUCA. This is a term which I think the US Army coined during the Cold War. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But it is a quality that, of course, is very hard to define because it is so intangible. Indeed, the ability to navigate through complexity and chaos is almost alchemy. It's not science, it's a bit of art, but probably a bit more. Furthermore, you cannot get things right all the time. But those who have a history or track record of being more right more often are rare individuals, and I think Bilahari was one of them. One of the principal consumers of MFA's work during my time was Mr. Lee Kuan Yew himself. He often disagreed with our assessments or challenged them. And Bilahari was one of the few in the ministry whose assessments and judgments were, I guess, kind of respected by Mr. Lee. Not because of Mr. Lee, but because I worked with him on a daily basis, I grew to appreciate and rely on Bilahari's instincts and assessments. He was someone I wanted to have on my side whenever we had trouble, and this was not infrequent. For Bilahari, I think it was a combination of scholarship, passion, people skills, and an unsentimental understanding of what could be achieved through foreign policy and what could not. I say scholarship because Bilahari is by nature a scholar, even though he would vehemently deny such characterization. He does not accept things at face value, and I think that's a quality of a good diplomat. Instead, he looks for answers by reading widely and by actively courting those who can offer insights from the highbrow to the common man, and then reaching his own conclusions. This leads to his second quality, which is his ability to engage people, the essential quality of an effective diplomat. I'm not saying that he is a warm and fuzzy type of diplomat. In fact, he refers to himself in the book as the undiplomatic diplomat. But he remains, in my view, a master class in networking, and that is something generations of Singaporean diplomats have learned from him, but few could ever match. This network proved its utility time and again because he knew some of the dramatis personae involved in vexing policy issues. I vividly remember being called up for scolding by Mr. Lee, who was then Prime Minister, about a paper some of us had written. I think Bilahari was not involved. But Mr. Lee's assessment was scathing. He told us that our paper was a textbook analysis. It's probably the ultimate insult. But he dismissed it as having what he referred to as a theoretical flavor. We were dealing with a real-life issue, and theory was not good enough. He knew the people involved well. They would not react as the paper suggested. Chastened, we went back to the drawing board, having learnt an important lesson about foreign policy and diplomacy. I think Bilahari must have learnt that lesson very early in his career in MFA. Third, he belongs to a school of hard-nosed diplomacy. He has a deep understanding of Singapore's national interests. His analysis and his policy recommendations were always a masterful blend of good analysis, solid understanding of the background, the history of the issue, and of the key personalities. But never did he imbue any of these analysis with either wishful thinking or ideology. He never hesitated to call a spade, sometimes to the annoyance of the great and good. But most times, like Heng Chi, I found myself agreeing with him. And when I did not agree with him, I think I learned how to agree to disagree. But I think never did he act in a way that diminished Singapore's national interests. Instead, his framing was always what was in the national interest, and his approach and skills are all evident in this latest book, Singapore is Still Not an Island. He continues to show in this book of essays that hard-nosed approach that characterized his time in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At the same time, his scholarship is also evident. He is the model of what a good diplomat should be, widely read, informed, current, and nobody's fool. I would add that what is also evident in this book is not just his erudition, but his mastery of English. I recently discovered a word, oracy, which is the ability to express oneself in speech. Oracy is not a very strong tradition in Singapore, but Bilahari, the public intellectual, has demonstrated his skill in oracy in his speeches and his dialogues, which are mostly available for free on the internet. His pieces in Singapore is Still Not an Island also show that he expresses himself effectively in writing. They are models of clear, spare, and direct language. His use of English to put across complex ideas is both masterful, erudite, and elegant, but also economical in the use of the language. All these are in evidence in the essays contained in this, his latest book, and for these alone, they are worth reading and savoring. Thank you.
We've come to the part for the question and answers session. Time is running out, so we have about, I think, 10 minutes or so. I'd like to just briefly remind our friends who are attending in this auditorium that please limit yourself to just one question so that others may also have a chance. Please state your name and affiliation before you pose your question. And if you wish to direct your question specifically to one of the speakers on stage, you may do so by stating it. Who would like to start? Yes, please. Somebody will come with a microphone to you.
My name is Ken Ming, former Member of Parliament from Malaysia. Thank you, King Yong, for your comments just now. I hope that you can educate me on some of these social media distractions. I'm from Malaysia, so I don't know what you're referring to. Thank you very much, Bilahari, for your book. I've read the first one, looking forward to reading the second one. Realist, but not a crude realist. My question is directed to all three distinguished members of the panel. What do you think are some of the key challenges facing the 4G generation of leaders in Singapore, especially given the fact that I would say that not many of them have had the responsibility of trying to craft a new leadership narrative as well as retail politics with regards to foreign policy moving forward, especially with transition coming along. And maybe just add one B question. The China-US relationship has taken a lot of center stage, but what do you think are the main challenges with regards to dealing with the Malaysian-Singaporean relationship, especially with all the changes in government that have happened and may still happen in the next couple of years? Thank you very much for your indulgence.
Who would like to start? You have to pick. You have to use the.
Peter and I am not. So.
You have to use the microphones. Yes.
There are two questions, so I will take the first one on the key challenges for the 4G leaders. I passed the relationship, Singapore-Malaysia relationship to the two who have been crafting those points of agreement. Can you hear me? Yeah. And right. What are the key challenges for the 4G leadership? I think they're the same challenges for the present leadership, except because it is a new leadership. Right now, you are, 3G and 4G as one. When you have a new prime minister, I think the tests will be there for him. We have always anticipated in Singapore that whenever we have a new leader, major countries will want to test the leaders. So we are thinking about that already, you know, and I think we will know how to react. And certainly the new 4G Prime Minister, you know, Lawrence Wong, would certainly know how to do it. As you can see, he is out there every day making a speech, engaging with everybody. He has really been thrown into the arena. So by the time he takes over, we do not know when. Is it at the end of the elections or before the elections? He would have run up the experience. I also believe that, frankly, we should never be too quick to judge. You know, Singaporeans here are always asking, oh, what do you think about the 4G leaders? Will they do well? Will they do well? I say this is a Singapore luxury. In no other country would we say, do you think so-and-so will do well? Do you think X will do well? Y will do well? You get the leader who is there. You know, the United States has elected President Trump, Britain has elected Boris Johnson, you know. So, you know, in the world, we have leaders that make mistakes and leaders who do not come up with too good policies. The test of the leader is that the leader should, in fact, be able to come out of the hole if they've fallen into a hole with the policies. And that has happened even with the Lee Kuan Yew team. You know, we did merger, didn't work out, but they climbed out of the hole. I also have this optimism, but I don't think it's ill-placed, that you never know the leaders till they take charge. And then they do things that will surprise you. And frankly, the test has already been there. They've handled the pandemic quite well, you know. So I'm not pessimistic, okay? On retail politics, on narratives, I think we are dealing with narratives now. We're very aware of narratives in Singapore because we are seeing what's happening, particularly with the Ukraine war. You know, we suddenly find out that, you know, a narrative comes, takes over, and people are just spouting it. And the social media, in fact, has made narratives very important. So, but I think, you know, we will be able to work with that. The retail foreign policy part, we have to work at it. I bring this up because I don't think there's enough retail foreign policy done at the moment.
You want to say?
No, you first.
Oh, well, I would first say that the response to your two questions are actually embedded in Bilahari's book's title, because Singapore is not an island. It's still not an island. We live in a highly interconnected world, and that interconnected world is what causes the big challenges we will have to face, whether we are 4G leadership or 3G leadership or whatever G we are, we'll have to face the problem of interconnectedness. So what happens in one part of the world is going to affect us. But there's another aspect of this challenge which I think is not so clear, but is beginning to, some definitions are beginning to emerge to shape this particular challenge. And this is that changes are happening thick and fast. And Adam Tooze has described this as the polycrisis, many crises happening at the same time. The former senior minister, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, has called this the perfect long storm, which is many structural crises, whether it is climate change, US, China, the debt problem. All of these are happening at the same time. These are big structural, almost existential trends. And worse still, they are interacting with each other. They are not happening within their own silos. They are interacting with each other. And the problem is they're going to produce outcomes which nobody can predict. And they are happening so fast. There's a characteristic of acceleration in these changes that any body in any government, whether you're a Singapore leader, 4G leader, or in any other government around the world, is finding it extremely difficult to cope with the extent of these changes, the uncertainty that the changes provide, and the uncertain outcomes. So I would say for this, anybody in government will have to respond by having some humility to realize that they don't have all the answers. They must be willing to try things out, because to do nothing is probably the worst response to this situation. But also there must be an underlying narrative, if you will, that there's no such thing as a perfect or right answer. You have to be prepared to try things out, and if it doesn't quite work, change course a bit. And I think that's the kind of world we live in.
Well, Kiamin, I think you know better than any of us else in this room that Malaysian politics is rapidly evolving. And I also happen to think that Indonesia has not yet reached a stable post-Suharto equilibrium. What Peter said and what Heng Chi said, I entirely agree. This is an interconnected world. But like it or not, the most intimate connections are going to be with your immediate neighbors. Despite the uncertainties, I think we all share one thing in common. We know this. Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. We have to live together. Whether we agree or disagree, we have to live together. And as long as three of us do not lose sight of this fundamental reality, we can manage. We can't predict the future. As Peter said, you try something, it doesn't work, well, what do? Immediately try something else, right? You try something else, it may work for a time, but as sure as the sun rises, it will not work after a time. So you keep adapting. But you always adapt with your most intimate connections in mind, because you can't get away from your neighbors. We keep this in mind, we'll be all right.
Another question? Yes? The gentleman with his hand up.
Thank you. My name is Sun Xi. I'm a graduate of Li Kuan School of Public Policy. I'm from China. So I know, three panelists are excellent diplomats of Singapore. That's why Singapore was so successful in the past, and I think it will be also successful in the future. I know all of you prefer challenging questions, so I will ask a sensitive one.
Keep it short
yeah,
and limit it to one.
Okay. If taking sides become inevitable in the future between US and China, which side will you choose? Not the speaker for Singapore, but individually, personally, which side will you choose and why? Thank you.
Hey, Sun
We
Si,
spent quite a long
you are
time.
my old friend, and you know the answer. Actually, we have all already chosen our side. It's side of Singapore.
Is there anybody else who would like to pose a question? Because right at the back, right, very quickly, because time's running out for us. Yes.
Hi, I'm Chia Hao from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy as well. Yeah, so I'm a student. Yeah, so actually I'd like to ask, amidst the US-China rivalry, can ASEAN still continue to maintain its coherence and unity? And if there are challenges to its coherence, how can ASEAN work together to address them? Thank you.
There's a lot said and written up about the lack of unity in ASEAN. I would say global developments, whether it's in Europe or in Asia, challenge regional groupings. It's very difficult to get unified foreign policy perspectives or common perspectives at the same time from different countries in the grouping. And ASEAN has always had that difficulty. First, we don't have a common foreign policy perspective. but we can arrive at a common communique, agreement on a communique. We don't force people, countries into the same perspective. I think in Europe, it's fair to say, how European countries deal with Russia has always been slightly different until Ukraine. Now that's brought the European countries together. But how long that unity is going to last is also a question. So the idea of ASEAN's unity must be seen in that perspective. So I do not know what criteria people use when they talk of ASEAN unity. What is unity? Unified on what? We can always come to some agreement on a communique. And sometimes you don't get complete agreement. You deal with the differences, but the organization carries on, and it has to, because if it breaks up, you will have to invent a new one, and everybody understands that. So maybe we are asking the wrong question. On ASEAN centrality, well, I have to say, ASEAN keeps insisting. Sometimes they get it, but we shouldn't take. I know this sounds cynical, like Bilahari, but I would say we should be a little humble about the insistence on centrality. But I think the major powers know that ASEAN has its uses, because ASEAN is non-threatening. If ASEAN proposes an idea, it's better accepted in the wider region. If it is, the United States, people may step back. If it's Japan, they may step back. When Russia tried to do that, everybody steps back. When China steps forward with an idea, everybody looks at it, a little more suspiciously. ASEAN, sure. ASEAN supports it, we'll support it. And that's how it is, So, and frankly, if you talk of the ASEAN losing its centrality or unity, I would say look at how the discussion on the free and open Indo-Pacific has gone. In fact, when the idea of the Indo-Pacific strategy was first proposed during the Trump period, it was slightly different, much harder, and it sounded much more like excluding a country. It was seen by ASEAN countries as targeted against China. And it had the danger of moving far more on a sort of security basis. However, because all the ASEAN countries talked about it, President Biden's team has taken that to heart, and I think has adjusted the Indo-Pacific strategy. And Indonesia came up with AOIP, the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And all these countries now, the major powers, countries who are supporting Indo-Pacific and the Quad, say they support AOIP. We emphasize in the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific that we would not be exclusive. It's an inclusive approach. So ASEAN has still some influence, I would say, And if you talk of ASEAN centrality, perhaps that's a demonstration of ASEAN centrality.
You have said it all, Heng-Chi, so nobody else has anything left to say.
Well,
You are mocking me.
No, I'm not mocking. I would never dare mock you.
This is a part of my life which I shelved when I retired 13 years ago, so I don't follow this area that much. But in a way, the issue, I think, is not so much about ASEAN from a Singapore foreign policy view. ASEAN must always be there, but it will go through its ups and downs, and we'll have to manage that. I think the most pressing issue which we do have to spend a lot of time thinking about is a term which we don't hear so much these days, and that term is the regional architecture, which is how relationships among countries, relationships within groupings, and I'm not just talking about ASEAN groupings, there are so many, there are economic groupings, there's CTP, I can't even remember the term, they've got APEC, you've got all these groupings, and all of them play roles in promoting their own interests. And I think it's very important for us to understand what role they should play in terms of both promoting peace and stability, but also promoting that level playing field of trade that and enable economic growth. And I think that's a very important part of our foreign policy thinking that I think we should pay a lot of attention to. So it's not just ASEAN, it's APEC, it's even the larger global groupings, whether it's the UN and all that. All these are very important, and it reflects again on this idea that Singapore is not an island. You're connected to all these individual countries, but we are also connected to each of these groupings. What emphasis do we want to give to each of these groupings? ASEAN is not the be-all and end-all. It's important, but it's not the be-all and end-all.
Just one small point to supplement what Peter and Heng Chee have already said. Peter is too modest. He is the one who introduced the term regional architecture into the ASEAN lexicon. But you know, this is to support what both of them have said. Our region, our broader region, the thing we now call the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, is a very large, diverse and messy region. So the regional architecture is not going to be a single thing. There will be a place for ASEAN, there is a place for the Quad, there is a place for AUKUS, there is a place for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and there will be place for the CPTPP, the RCEP, and many others that will evolve in due time. In other words, the regional architecture will be one, not a single thing, but one of multiple overlapping frameworks. And that probably is going to be much more resilient than a single structure that can prove brittle if subjected to sharp shocks. And on that note, I'll shut up.
And on that note, we shall move on to the formal launch of the book. So you may step down if you like, and I shall now invite our guest of honor. Bilahari, you will stay there with Mr. Wong Kang Seng for the book launch formality on either side of that. And a copy for Mr. Wong. More photos?
Can you also come now?
Thank you. Well, let me, on behalf of everybody here, thank Mr. Wong for his presence as our guest of honor, the commentators, Professor Chan and Mr. Peter Ho, for adding their insights to this afternoon's rich discussion, the events and corporate communications team at the RSIS for organizing this event, the publishing team at Straits Times Press, especially Jill and Liang, who are watching the proceedings in the other room, for bringing this publication out in a timely way. And I would like to end on the happy note of inviting all of you on behalf of RSIS to a little reception with refreshments in the adjoining room. Thank you very much once again for being here and spending time with us.